This Clan Robertson program is a journey of discovery sweeping through the ages. To meet with ghosts of times past, to hear their stories, to explore the ancient castles, the homes of your ancestors, and discover the roots and richness of your Scottish heritage and name. And there is no better place to start our journey than here in Glasgow, Scotland's great industrial city in the foothills of the Highlands. Today, people come from all over the world to visit this historic city. But 200 years ago, these bustling streets were thronged with people here for a very different reason. Some following hardship in the Highlands, others seeking opportunity and adventure, came here to the port of Greenock in the Firth of Clyde, where they took ship for the Americas, and later for the younger countries of Australia and New Zealand, an emigration which continued almost to the middle of this century. But wherever they went in the world, these millions of Scots took with them the heritage, the sense of history, the traditions of this, their homeland. From scenes like these, old Scotia's grandeur springs. It makes her loved abroad, revered at home. From the towering snow-capped highlands in the north, through the purple-heathered glens of swirling mist, and onto the softly rolling hills of the borders, this ancient and beautiful land of Scotland is held dear in the hearts of millions of Scots worldwide. The story of Scotland and of her peoples is as complex and diverse as the many different cultures and traditions which have merged to form this most unique of countries. Cultures which have clashed through time, Highland and Lowland, Jacobite and Hanoverian, and yet have given birth to the stirring romanticism of the Gaelic lordship of the Isles, and to the remarkable achievements of the royal house of Stuart. Our story begins over 6,000 years ago, with the arrival of the first settlers in Scotland. These early pioneers discovered a deeply forested land, brooding and impenetrable. They settled along the coast and on the riverbanks. They lived by fishing and hunting in the dark woodlands. Enigmatic remains of these peoples can still be found. But their lives and thoughts are lost to us now, kept secret in this land once called Alba, now called Scotland. The Roman legions marched into Scotland about 80 AD, and it is from their historians we have the first records of this land and of her peoples. To the northeast, the oldest inhabitants, known as the Picti, or the Painted People, whose origin is unknown to us. In the western Highlands, the Gaelic-speaking Celts, or Scoti, who had sailed from Ireland. Across the lowland areas were the Brythonic Celts. Their legends were those of King Arthur, and theirs was the magical land of Camelot. The Romans, who had conquered the known world, never managed to quell the indomitable spirit of Scotland. They ruled Britain for almost 4 centuries, but built the famous Hadrian's Wall to keep the warlike Scots at bay. With the collapse of the Roman Empire, the Anglo and the Saxon came to the lowlands. In time, Viking raiders came too, and with fire and sword conquered the north, east, and much of the Western Isles. For hundreds of years, Viking, Saxon, Celt, and Pict clashed in their battle for supremacy. The skill and courage of these warriors is reflected in the game of shinty, still played in the Highlands today. By the 11th century, the Gaelic Highlands won out. And as Gaelic became the principal language and culture, so the Gaelic use of surnames became widespread. They developed from 4 principal roots: from a person's occupation, as in Fearson, meaning parson; from a place of residence, as in Sutherland, from the lands of Sutherland; from a physical feature, as in Armstrong, a literal reference to a strong arm. The most popular form of surname in Scotland, however, is the Gaelic use of the word Mac, meaning son of, as in MacDonald, son of Donald. The name Robertson means quite literally son of Robert. And it is from Robert Rioch, grizzled Robert, that the name Robertson is derived. For a person with Scottish roots, your surname is only one clue in the search for your ancestry, for unique to Scotland is the ancient system of clans. The word clana is derived from the Gaelic and means children or family. It is used in its present-day context to mean an extended family, often, though not always, sharing a common name, united under a chief and bound together by a shared heritage. The clans practiced a sophisticated system of government which survived often independently of the rest of Scotland for nearly 5 centuries. They often banded together into great confederations. The Clan Chattan and the Lordship of the Isles were the most enduring. Indeed, so powerful did the lordship become that its power stretched along the entire western seaboard and reached inland to include much of what is now considered Highland. Few today know more about this age-old method of kinship and government than Rob MacDonald Parker of the Clandonald Centre at Armadale.
The clans in Scotland have been around since the 11th century and probably beyond that. The word clan is an old Gaelic word which means children. A closer description would perhaps be kin. The clans as we know them today are probably much later. After the Lordship of the Isles collapsed in the 15th century, the families kind of broke out into their own separate branches, and groups such as the Keppochs and the Glengarrys identified themselves much more clearly under a clan chief. By and large, they lived very democratically, particularly through the period of the Lordship of the Isles, where on the council meetings, MacDonald sat at the head of the table, but he was surrounded by MacLeans and MacLeods and McKinnons and other clans who equally had a part in this council. And they traded and they bartered and they arranged marriages and they passed laws and they heard complaints. And while the rest of the world would believe we were all red-haired, hairy Highlanders running out of the heather, I think there was some form of government that was quite beyond what was happening in other places. Well, the structure, of course, was the chief would be at the head, considered in the clan terms as the first amongst equals. His lieutenants, or his right hand, so to speak, would be the closest members of his family, and throughout the clan it would descend in order of your closeness to the chief. And the way this was interpreted was the job of the Shenachie, which is the Gaelic historian. And his job was to remember all of the family descendances. And obviously the closer you could be to the chief, the better status you had within the clan. Obviously up until the Second Rebellion in 1745, the clans operated quite well under their clan chiefs. But after the Battle of Culloden, the whole system collapsed. And in 1746, the Prescription Act was passed by the government, which insisted that the families, the children of the chiefs, had to go south for education. And of course, they came back anglicized as opposed to being Highland. The family still comes into it. Today, I meet American clansmen, Australian clansmen, and I feel as if I've known them all my life. They're invited to my home, I'm invited to their home, and we only met each other maybe 10 minutes before, and it's just this, there's a complete relaxation and trust of a fellow clan member. I go to America once a year to speak to the Clandonald USA annual general meeting, and I'm always amazed that having made the long journey from Scotland to America, when I get there and I walk in, it's almost like I've just been next door for the last year. People say, "Hi Rob," like they see me all the time, and it's wonderful. It's a wonderful relationship.
The forefathers from which your clan derive are the ancient Earls of Atholl. The early chiefs of Clandonachy were designated Deartola. The chief, from whom the clan derives its name, was Duncan Reaver, Stout Duncan, who led his clan in support of Robert the Bruce at Bannockburn in 1314. Duncan left two sons, Robert, ancestor of the Robertsons of Struan, and Patrick, ancestor of the Robertsons of... This is the burial place of the chiefs, and in the heartland of the Robertson heritage. They say that the Robertsons are descended from St. Columba himself. Maybe so. Theirs is a harsh, harsh history. Yet on this green knoll, at the confluence of the Garry and the Eruchte, there's a peace and a stillness that speaks to the listening ear. Of course, all the other families of the Clan Donaghy, including the Duncans, Donaghys, Reeds, Colliers and MacIvers, can claim to share this same heritage. Robert married a younger daughter of the Stirlings of Glenesk, and when her inheritance passed to her nephew, Sir David Lindsay, the Robertsons contested it vehemently. Lindsay arranged a meeting which the Robertsons never kept, preferring instead to take the advice of a Stuart kinsman and sweep into Angus to bloody the usurper's nose. This they did, laying the country waste in their wake. Lindsay was badly wounded, and the Ogilvy, Sheriff of Angus, was killed, leading a force of armed troopers into Athol in pursuit. The third chief of Robertson became a hostage with the English for King James I's ransom. James was to feature again in the fortunes of the Robertsons when, following the king's assassination in Perth, Sir Robert Graham fled into Athol. The Robertsons played a major part in bringing Graham to justice, and the recumbent wild man in chains below the Robertsons' arms is an augmentation granted to commemorate this deed. The Robertson lands were also erected into a barony at this time. At the same time, the Robertson chief was dying of wounds inflicted by one Forester of Torwood, a nephew of the Bishop of Dunkeld. The Robertsons never forgave the Dunkeld bishops and continued to persecute them with great relish, so much so that they were accused at one stage of showering Bishop Lauder with arrows while he tried to say Mass. The Struan lands were under mortgage for a debt of £1,500 to the Earl of Athol early in the 16th century. Seeing his opportunity, the Earl tried to foreclose, but the clan, led by the ruthless William MacPatrick Vic Donaghy, opposed the Earl. For his insolence, William was captured and beheaded at Tullymont, an ancient seat of justice in Athol. For the remainder of the 16th century, the Robertsons were in better harmony with the Athol Earls, and the two even joined forces against the rebellious MacGregors who were at the time terrorizing Rannoch. This harmony with the Earls did not mean that all went well for the Robertsons, however. The seventh chief was captured by the MacGregors, and the eighth chief lost much of the clan's lands through debt. The most important factor in the development of Scottish culture, and ultimately the clan system, was the advent of Christianity, brought to Scotland in the 6th century by St. Columba. Columba was an Irishman, a Celtic prince of the O'Neills and a most remarkable man. To atone for the blood he had shed as a warrior, he became a priest and chose to exile himself as a missionary in Scotland. He arrived in Dalriada in 563, just at a time when the Christian Scots had been crushed by the pagan Picts. Nevertheless, the hero Columba penetrated far into northern Pictland, converting the Druids to Christianity, and, it is said, quelling a monster he encountered in Loch Ness. Then he came to Iona and founded its monastery. Iona became an important ecclesiastical centre with contacts throughout Europe. The spirit of Columba can still be sensed here on the hauntingly beautiful Isle of Iona. The monastery remains a place of pilgrimage and great spiritual power. The shared Christianity of Celt and Pict created an atmosphere of mutual trust and intermarriage.
Here once stood the ancient city of Scone, the very first capital of Scotland and the heart of its history and faith. For this is a place of kings. Here, after years of bitter enmity and wars, the Celts of the west and the Picts of the east were at last united under one high king.
Kenneth MacAlpin, of mixed Celt and Pictish blood, was crowned king in 842. When Malcolm Canmore was crowned king of Scotland 200 years later, Scotland had become firmly established as a nation-state. Despite the rule of a single king, the clans maintained their own independence. There was much feuding and bloody warfare. In the early part of the 17th century, the Robertsons were fearful for their future and rallied around their chief. The clan chief enlisted the aid of the Earl of Erroll, Lord High Constable of Scotland, whose grandmother had been a Robertson. Shortly afterwards, the Robertson chieftains of Fascali, Straloch, Lude, Munsey, Delcaben and Culvine signed a bond allying themselves to their chief and giving their word to maintain his house and estate insofar as they were able. In 1622, the earldom of Athol passed to the Murrays, who set about restoring honour to the Athol men. A roll of arms was taken in 1638, and these were soon to be needed when the Covenanters appointed Robertsons to their committee of war at Dunkeld. In 1644, the great Montrose walked through Athol to raise King Charles' standard at Lude and appointed a Robertson to hold Blair Castle for the king. Graham's kinsman, Black Pate of Inchbrackey, was related to both Robertsons by marriage, and as the chief and Earl of Athol were still minors, Clondonaghy placed itself under Pate's command. In the royalist triumphs of the ensuing year, the Robertsons played their part, as they were to do in years to come. Although Malcolm Canmore's Scotland was a resolutely independent nation, events further south were soon to have an impact. In 1066, England was invaded by the Normans. Within 1 year, they had totally crushed all opposition. A wave of refugees swept north for the sanctuary of Malcolm Canmore's Scotland. Among them, Edgar and Margaret, the children of the deposed King of England.
When the English royal family fled to Scotland after the Norman invasion, King Malcolm fell quickly and deeply in love with the Princess Margaret. They were married soon after. It was a marriage that brought many changes to Scotland.
Under Queen Margaret's influence, the Gaelic culture was slowly eroded in the lowlands. The Scots dialect of English began to replace Gaelic as the spoken language. The dress and manners of the English court became commonplace, and the Scottish church was radically altered. In time, the Normans and the Scots of the lowlands began a period of intermarriage, trade and commerce. Much land was granted to the Norman knights, who established their own family dynasties. Lord Elgin, a descendant of Robert the Bruce, whose own family was established at this time.
I think you would usually say that it was families north of the Highland line in Scotland, where a great chief, the strongest member of a family, had established himself and his descendants, all of whom consider themselves descended from the original chief. Sometimes he was undoubtedly a figure which could be pointed out historically. Other times, I believe you might almost say that it was a figment of the imagination. But still, this feeling that every member was directly descended from the original chief. In other parts of Scotland, families undoubtedly had a close network of relationships, but I think they tended to consider their new family as equally as important as the original one. And in the case of my own family of Bruce, many of the junior branches of the family have been immensely distinguished and are entirely separate, as it were, in their way of thinking, and could not be considered in the same way as Highland families.
The great Norman families of the lowlands, newly established in the 1100s, were to play a major part in the growth and development of Scotland. England became fearful of this developing strength, and in 1244 launched the first of many invasions. For almost a century, the opposing armies clashed violently on the battlefields of the border. This warfare brought Scotland to the brink of disaster. The death of the king, Alexander III, in 1286, plunged the country into chaos. All seemed lost until the emergence of a new leader, Sir William Wallace. Wallace led an ever-increasing band of independent Scots into battle against the English, and with an ad hoc army, vastly outnumbered, he achieved victory after victory.
Here at Stirling Bridge, in 1297, the patriot Sir William Wallace routed the English army. King Edward was so incensed that he came to Scotland himself, and for 2 whole years harried Wallace and his followers. Finally, in 1305, Wallace was betrayed, captured, and brought to the Tower of London, where he was hanged, drawn, and quartered.
Edward's dream of a Scotland subject to the English crown was almost a reality. All that remained for him was to place his ally, John Comyn, on the throne. But Wallace's gruesome execution was not to be in vain. One of Edward's supporters, the young Scottish knight Robert the Bruce, had been inspired by Wallace's struggle for a free Scotland. In February 1306, Bruce called John Comyn to a fateful meeting in Greyfriars Church. The two men argued, swords were drawn, Comyn was struck and left fatally wounded at the altar. Bruce was forced into the life of a fugitive, pursued across the lowlands and highlands. Despite the impossible odds, many Scots slowly rallied to his banner. Towns and then castles came under his control. Essential to his campaign was the control of Stirling Castle. The garrison there agreed to surrender to Bruce if it was not relieved by the 24th of June. The massed armies of Edward II headed north and were in place by June 23rd. Bruce drew up his army on the banks of the Bannockburn.
The Battle of Bannockburn took place on the morning of Midsummer's Day, 1314. Bruce, knowing he had the smaller forces, chose to occupy this high land, thus forcing the English army to come at him up the hill. At sunrise, the battle commenced, but the English armour soon found itself bogged down in the marshland waterlogged by the Bannockburn, and the English archers could find no place from which to attack. Sir Henry de Bohun, one of the bravest of the Norman knights, challenged Bruce to single combat. The Scots warrior king at once accepted. In the ensuing duel, he neatly avoided the Norman's lance and, swinging his battle-axe around his head in a huge arc, cleaved the Norman's skull with a single blow. The Scots cheered and charged, and before noon, King Edward was in full flight for the English border.
14 years of cross-border raiding followed until a treaty was finally signed. Scotland had won the day, and Robert the Bruce was her undisputed king. Bruce's campaign took place during the heyday of heraldry. One of Scotland's leading experts on heraldry is Alistair Campbell of Ayards, from the court of the Lord Lion.
It is a remarkable thing, but heraldry today in Scotland is more alive and part of our national life than it ever has been. It was in 1672 that the splendid series of arms recorded in Lion Office was first commenced. And in the last 30 years, there have been as many grants and matriculations of arms as there were in the whole of the previous period put together. Heraldry came into Scotland, as with most of the rest of Europe, towards the middle of the 12th century. It had 3 important uses. The first, for personal identification, for people who were clad in all-enveloping armour, which might well have led to an unfortunate mistake in the heat of battle. Secondly, as a means of locating leaders in the field. And thirdly, very importantly, in the form of personal seals, as a means of authentication of important legal documents in a day and age when very few people, apart from the clergy, were capable of signing their own names. To make the system work, it required control, and here we see the arrival of the heralds. In Scotland, the chief post is held by the Lord Lion, King of Arms, whose origins go back to the royal Shenachie of the ancient Celtic kings, although his title in its present form is first recorded in the 1300s. In Scotland, he is Her Majesty's Supreme Officer of Honour, to whom the monarch has delegated responsibility for all matters armorial. He is also responsible for state ceremonial and is a judge of the realm with very considerable powers. Heraldry in Scotland is very firmly controlled, and as a result it's the purest system in existence today. At the outset, it must be stressed that there is no such thing in Scotland as a family or clan coat of arms. Grant of arms is to one person and to one person only. And once that grant's been made, the arms pass without further formality to whoever inherits as head of the family. Other members of the family may take out arms which are suitably different from those borne by its head. And in the same way, people of the same name, although they cannot trace their exact relationship, are given arms which are recognizably relative to those of the chief. And in this way, in Scotland, to the trained eye, it is always possible to recognize to which clan or family somebody belongs and their position in it. The full armorial achievement of Robertson of Struan, chief of the Clan Robertson, is a red shield with on it 3 silver wolves' heads. Underneath it is the figure of a savage bound in chains, which represents the capture of Sir Robert Graham, the killer of King James I, by the chief of the clan at the time. His supporters, which denote his chiefly rank, are also interesting, being as they are on one side a serpent and on the other a dove. The Latin for dove is columba, and the Robertsons, who ultimately descend from King Duncan, through him descend from the kindred of St. Columba. Above the chief's shield is his helmet, on which is his crest, a hand holding a crown, and above that again the motto in Latin, Virtutis Gloria Merces, glory is the reward of virtue. As you can see in the illustration here shown, this makes up the crest badge which may properly be worn by all members of the clan, the hand holding the crown surrounded by a buckled strap on which is the chief's motto.
It was near here at Struan in 1437 that the Robertsons captured Sir Robert Graham, the murderer of James I, and for that were rewarded by the barony of Struan. The whole story is told here in the museum, and if you're a Robertson, you'll want to know all about it. As well as Struan, the Robertsons held lands on the banks of Lochs Tay and Rannoch, but most of these have gone now, leaving only a vestige, an important part of which is the Clan Museum at Brewer, just north of Blair Athol. Clach na Bratach, the stone of the standard. It is said that this mysterious little crystal was unearthed by clansmen of Clondonaghy when they took up their standard on their march to Bannockburn to meet with King Robert the Bruce. Since then, it has remained in the possession of the chiefs of the Clondonaghy, who have long been loyal to the House of Stuart. But on the eve of Sheriff Muir, a mysterious crack appeared on the stone, and from that time, the fortunes of the children of Duncan, of the Reeds, of the Robertsons, declined. In the previous century, they'd lost their lands to the Stuart of Athol, and by the 19th, they'd lost what was left in public sale. However, it is said that the stone here has healing properties. Who knows?
perhaps some future chief of the Clan Donarchy may yet have his lands restored, and he will become a true chieftain once again.
The 17th century brought troublesome times to Athol. The Earl's heiress married Murray of Tullibardine, but the title had gone to another line of the Stuarts, who proved most ineffective. The new Earl raided the normally passive Spaldings of Ashantully, aided by the Robertsons of Ascali and Lude. When the next Earl took over, he was charged by the Privy Council to answer for the great misrule prevalent in his lands. This misrule continued, however, and the Earl was imprisoned on the basis that he was responsible for the conduct of his subjects. And that conduct was certainly unruly. It was during this time that the Reeds of Pitnacree used a Dunkeld man for archery practice. The young Pitnacree complained of being dirt in his bed, and it was left to the Baron Reed to rescue a Spalding thief from captivity. During the second half of the 17th century, however, the Athol family reacquired many of the Robertson estates, and as a result, the Duke of Athol's armed following just before the Union included 274 called Robertson, 44 called Reed, 6 McConaughey's, and numerous others affiliated to Clan Donarchy. Struan, meantime, refused to recognise the sovereignty of the houses of Orange and Hanover, and troops were sent to Rannoch to watch him in case he tried to offer resistance. The Battle of Sheriff Muir in 1715, in which 250 Robertsons took part on the Jacobite side, saw the beginning of the end for this once most powerful clan. During the Second Rising in 1745, Lord George Murray, perhaps the most illustrious of Jacobite generals, led his Athol men out for Prince Charlie, while the redoubtable Lady Lude raised a company in that brigade. The Jacobite rising also inspired the elderly Struan Alexander, a notable poet who had fought at Sheriff Muir and fled to France until after his pardon in 1731, to lead his men out for the prince as far as Preston Pans near Edinburgh. He was unable, due to his great age, to go any further, and his men did not think any the less of him for it. He had been courageous, some undoubtedly thought foolish, to attempt to lead his men to battle in his condition. It is traditionally held that Struan returned to his native heath in the best possible comfort, having purloined General Cope's carriage. When Prince Charlie visited Blair, it was Lady Lude who entertained him, both then and when he attended a ball in the same place. As the Jacobites retreated towards the north in 1746, and Murray and his men were clearing Athol of Hanoverians, Lady Lude again played her part when she fired the first cannon that began the historic siege at Blair. This siege was the last that ever took place in Britain. The defeat of Bonnie Prince Charlie in 1745 signalled the end of the great power and influence that were for so long synonymous with your clan. Many of the clan, including the Robertsons, Duncans, Reeds and Roys, were to suffer most grievously. The Highland clearances which followed saw many thousands of the clan emigrate to escape the harshness of Scotland.
In the 200 years following the victory of Robert the Bruce, Scotland experienced a time of tremendous upheaval. The royal line of Scotland passed from the Bruce family to the Stuarts, a powerful dynasty often plagued by deceit, treachery, and greed. They sought to bring the clans of Scotland under their direct rule, to subdue the ancient Gaelic culture of the Highlands, a society based on equality, fair laws, and the code of hospitality, while the lowland system of government was feudal in nature. From the 14th to the 17th century, the Highlanders were continually harried by lowland armies who gradually won control. The age-old culture of the Lords of the Isles was passing into history. A time of great change across the entire continent of Europe, the 16th century Renaissance gave birth to the new Protestant faith. The charismatic preacher John Knox carried this new Christianity to the Scottish people, and within less than half a century it had become the dominant religion in Scotland. Spurred on by the ethos of this new religion, Scotland emerged as the world's leader in scientific, educational and technological achievement. However, not all were converted to this new faith, among them the royal house of Stuart. Their staunch adherence to Roman Catholicism was to play a decisive role in their eventual downfall. In 1542, a week-old baby, Mary Stuart, became Mary, Queen of Scots. 6 years later, she was sent to France and returned at the age of 17 to take her place on the Scottish throne. Scotland was unprepared for her beauty and passionate nature. Her youthful charm won her many admirers and many enemies. In 1587, she was betrayed and beheaded at the command of her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I of England. However, Elizabeth died childless, and Mary's son, James VI of Scotland, was crowned King James I of Scotland and England in 1603, the first monarch to rule both countries. The royal house of Stuart had reached the zenith of its power. 85 years later, it would be destroyed. Under Stuart rule, Britain was convulsed by two brutal civil wars. In the Second Civil War of 1689, James II became the last of the Stuart monarchs when he lost his crown to the Hanoverian William of Orange. He fled into exile, never to see Scotland again. The Stuart dynasty was to attempt to regain the throne one last time. In 1745, Prince Charles Edward Stuart, grandson of the exiled king, took ship from France, landing in the Western Highlands with the statement, "I am come home." Many of the Highland clans came out in support of Bonnie Prince Charlie, and his army marched to within 150 miles of London. Realizing that no English would join him, he retreated to his Scottish headquarters at Culloden near Inverness. He was followed by an English army led by the Duke of Cumberland. The Scots were wakened at dawn on the 16th of April 1746 by the English drums and a barrage of artillery fire. In less than half an hour, all the dreams and ambitions of Bonnie Prince Charlie and his supporters had been blown away in the smoke of battle. Cumberland showed no mercy. The wounded were slaughtered where they lay, and those captured were burned alive.
With the defeat at Culloden, Charlie's year, or Blin nach Jarlich, as it's called in the Gaelic, was all but over. Cumberland sent out his troops in pursuit of those who had been out with Charlie. The government soldiers set fire to their houses, drove out their cattle, and laid waste to their lands.
After nearly 400 years, the Stuart dynasty had finally come to an end. For the clans, Culloden was the final crushing blow. The victorious Hanoverian government in London began to systematically dismantle the Scottish nation to ensure that Scotland could never again threaten English power. Scottish people were forbidden to wear the tartan, denied the right to carry weapons, even forbidden to play the pipes. The clan chieftains were stripped of their political status and reduced to mere landowners. In time, these landowners saw a better profit in wool and mutton and began evicting the Highlanders. The clearances had begun. The once vibrant Highlands were soon left desolate, stripped of the culture and a people who had lived there for 1,000 years. The lands they had fought over, tilled and tended, were left bleak, populated only by sheep. The Scots have always had a sense of wanderlust, a pioneering spirit. Scots had been emigrating since the 16th century, indeed before that, often as mercenaries. But during the mid-18th century and on, they were actively encouraged to emigrate to the New Worlds, America, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Agents toured the country, employed by the various colonies to attract new settlers. The spirit of the Scots was spurred on by the lure of adventure and the opportunity to own land, land that could be passed on from generation to generation. In 1854, the Robertson lands and chieftain were burdened with debts and forced to sell the lands. Struan and Dunalister were sold, leaving only Rannoch. Earlier, the cadet branches of Fascale and Lude had been sold. The new owners of the lands had none of the ties of kinships that the chiefs had. This generally meant clearing the tenantry to make way for sheep farming, causing thousands to seek escape to the new worlds. Among the early pioneers of the North American continent in your clan was Joseph Duncan, who was the 6th governor of Illinois. His brother was the renowned General James Duncan. Another of the clan who was acclaimed in America was the portrait painter Archibald Robertson. Morgan Robertson put his experience as a merchant seaman to good use and wrote sea stories. His novels were distinguished for their adventurous spirit and fast-paced action. The contribution of your clan to the formation of the countries of Australia and New Zealand can be typified by people like John Robertson, 5 times Premier of New South Wales. He was one of the most famous land reformers of 19th century Australia. His father James brought him to Australia at the age of 6. The family settled in an area of New South Wales that became known as Robertson's Point. Scottish people have left their mark wherever they've gone. This impact is reflected in the wide variety of Scottish place names and organisations found the world over. The Aberdeens, the Edinburghs and Glasgows of the United States, the Fraser and Mackenzie Rivers of Canada, Dunedin in New Zealand, the Caledonian Societies and Burns Clubs, and of course the Highland Games that take place all over North America, Australia and New Zealand. For many people of Scottish descent, tracing their ancestral roots is an important way of tracing the richness of their heritage. Stuart Reid outlines some important points for the would-be genealogist.
The best advice I could give to people who are coming to Scotland to do the family tree is to find as much information as possible at home. Now, the best way to do that would be to ask their immediate family, other relatives, perhaps there's a family Bible, anything they can get. The objective would be to find a Scottish link. Now, by that I mean a birth, marriage or death that took place in Scotland. Once you'd ascertained a proper Scottish connection, that's a point to actually go to the record office or use a professional genealogist, and they would then take it back from there. Now, let's say it was an 1865 birth or something like that. There would be a copy of that birth certificate at the record office, which would take you to the next necessary step, for example, the parents' marriage, and so on and so on. It's difficult to say how far you can get back, because every case is completely different. But generally speaking, you're doing pretty well if you get back to the mid-1700s. It is possible to find living relatives in Scotland. A lot would really depend on whether they remained in Scotland and had issue. For example, let's say somebody's grandfather left Scotland. He may have had brothers and sisters who stayed in Scotland. So it is possible to see whether they had children, and so on up to the present day. So the bottom line is yes, we can trace living relatives in Scotland.
Whether you come to trace your roots or just to holiday, for the millions of people of Scottish origin worldwide, returning home to the land of your ancestors is a unique experience. Everywhere you go, and it's so easy to go everywhere, the friendliness of the people awaits you. There are no strangers, only friends you haven't met yet. It's a secluded villages and stunning surrounds are home to the many traditions and amenities for which Scotland is famous. Among these, it boasts the finest salmon fishing in the world. Where better